important topic. We are really thankful to the Michigan State Housing Development Authority for providing funding so that we can look at fair housing and protections against sexual harassment this afternoon. We're also going to look at harassment based on other protected classes, but our main focus today is on sexual harassment. So thanks again to MSHDA for allowing us to provide this training. A little bit of housekeeping. The session will be recorded and the video will be made available on our website, and you will receive that link after the class. All attendees are muted and your cameras are off, so please use the chat if you need technical assistance. Please use the Q&A feature to post questions. That's easier for us to make sure that we can track those and get answers to you, either by typing a response or answering them as we go. We'll have time for more questions at the end of the training today. You should have an evaluation open in your browser. If you're watching as a group, you'll want to share the link and we'll post that in the chat towards the end of the class. If you do want a certificate for attending today, those can be requested in the evaluation, so make sure you complete that. It's a SurveyMonkey link, and we'd like to have that completed no later than the end of the day tomorrow. So if you could prioritize getting that done, we would appreciate it. And again, this training is sponsored by MSHDA, and we're very thankful they've enabled us to provide a pretty much a year's worth of really great fair housing content. And again, that will be made available online on our YouTube page, where you can check out other videos and trainings that we've offered under MSHDA's generous sponsorship. So joining me today is Brianna Miranda, an Education and Outreach Coordinator with the Fair Housing Center. She'll be co-presenting with me. I'm Liz Keegan, the Director of Education and Outreach here at the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan, and helping us keep everything online and in order is Lindsay Owens. They are also an Education and Outreach Coordinator here at the center. So again, thanks so much for joining us. We do want to honor your time, so we're going to dive in and get started. I think probably the most important thing we can leave you with is our phone numbers, our emails, our website. Do check us out on Facebook. We always have good information being posted and shared on Facebook as well. So I do encourage you also to look at our website. We have a lot of information that you can sort by language, topic, protected class, etc. So you'll have lots of links. Lindsay's reminding us that you should have received an email with handouts for today's training. I think that went out yesterday afternoon. If you haven't gotten that, please provide Lindsay your email and they will send the attachments to you. The PowerPoint summary that's included with those handouts has all of these links that you can go through and click at your leisure or when you're looking for additional information. So I think I covered all the housekeeping. If not, feel free to chime in, team, and welcome. Thank you all for logging on. We had such a great response to this class, and we appreciate you taking time to think about this issue today. So we'll talk briefly about what the fair housing laws and protections currently are. We'll talk about national trends and some case data in regards to sexual harassment and harassment. And then we'll kind of talk about those two different types of cases, focusing more, as I said, on sexual harassment, but a lot of the legal treatment and the types of cases that can be brought under the umbrella of harassment and sexual harassment are strongly correlated or quite similar. So we will do our best to differentiate, but this is a unique area of the law and a really important one, as you'll find out. We've seen increases in housing or harassment taking place in housing. And so glad to make you all aware of that trend. We'll look at what the laws should be doing and how they're applied, and then talk a little bit about how discrimination can be reported and what that process looks like before sharing some tools and resources. So again, we will provide an evaluation link that you can fill out to mark your attendance and to request a certificate for your time today. Please use the Q&A feature. We really enjoy getting questions from you. So use Q&A for that. And if you need any technical assistance, feel free to use the chat. Before we get into our content, I do want to share a content warning. This training will discuss and does contain real life examples of discrimination that may be traumatizing or difficult to hear and discuss. A lot of the cases have a lot of traumatic incidents associated with them. The language is really unpleasant, but we also want to be upfront and share that information so that everyone can recognize and hopefully report housing discrimination. But we just want to acknowledge this is a real life incident that has happened to a lot of people. It can be very difficult to hear about, but it's important that we learn about it and recognize it, and hopefully working together, we can stop it. The Fair Housing Center was founded in 1980. We are a private nonprofit, in case you're new to us. I think a lot of you are not, so thank you so much for joining us. We have, since we were founded, worked to prevent illegal housing discrimination as best we can, and if we find it, we work to eliminate it. It's all about upholding housing choice and making sure, to the best of our ability, that equal housing opportunities are available across our communities, meaning people are free to choose housing that meets their needs, free from illegal discrimination based on protected classes. Part of our mission is also to promote inclusive communities. We do education, we do outreach, we do research and advocacy, and we do enforcement in terms of accepting allegations of housing discrimination. We are not an enforcement authority. As I mentioned, we're a private nonprofit, but we work with enforcement agencies, and we'll talk about those groups today, but that's HUD, the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, or MDCR, the Department of Justice, or DOJ. We always involve appropriate authorities, especially when we're dealing with cases like we're going to look at today. Our first priority is to make sure that people are safe in their homes when they're dealing with harassment and sexual harassment. So none of us are attorneys, so we therefore cannot provide any legal advice. All the information provided today is for educational purposes only. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We're very passionate about our work because we believe that where you live directly impacts how you live. So having the freedom to choose your housing freely is very important, even in this market that we're experiencing today, which is, as we know, very tight. There's issues with not being able to afford housing, not being able to find accessible housing with features that meet the needs of people with disabilities, all kinds of barriers that exist in our current housing market. We're focusing on fair housing and illegal housing discrimination today. So we have a list here of all the things that we don't do, and we're happy to refer you to great partner agencies across our service area that do this important work. I see some of them are on the call today. So thank you very much for joining us. This slide hopefully reiterates that all we do is fair housing. We don't work with properties that aren't being maintained unless it's a discriminatory maintenance program. Which does happen. We don't provide housing, we don't do credit counseling, we don't teach homebuyers classes, we don't work on foreclosure prevention. If any of these partners are of interest, please let us know, we'll connect you there. If they discover housing discrimination, they will loop us in, but these are all other services outside of what we do. We do have other traditional fair housing centers across the state. There's a group in Detroit, there's a group in Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti area, and a group down in Kalamazoo. In addition to our center, we are located in Grand Rapids, but as you can see, all of us centers cover a very large area. There's also a legal services group based out of the Flint area that does some fair housing. So we work together to the best of our ability to cover the entire state of Michigan, and we're happy to be your first call for help and resources. Our counties here are green on this map. So as I mentioned, fair housing is all about the ability to choose housing free from unlawful discrimination. It's tied to the protected classes that are listed out under federal, state, and various local fair housing laws. So we'll take a moment to really look at the protected classes. If you're ever unsure if something is a fair housing issue, please feel free to visit our website or reach out to us. But it's all based on laws that exist kind of on a tiered basis, looking at federal, state, and local fair housing laws. Those of you who have been through a lot of trainings, and I do see familiar names here joining us today, you know the list of protected classes has grown quite a bit. Did I miss that? Okay, we're going to look back there. We also want to emphasize that fair housing laws prohibit differences in treatment or discrimination in any housing transaction. So whether somebody is looking to rent or buy, get a home loan, get homeowners insurance, they shouldn't be treated differently because of any of the protected classes. Fair housing laws can also cover land use and zoning decisions. So if there were a conversation about building a shelter for unhoused individuals or housing specifically for families with children or people with disabilities, sometimes neighborhoods aren't always very welcoming and want to discriminate against those types of housing projects, and that would be illegal as well. So our list of protected classes is pretty substantial now. It's grown since I started working in fair housing in the early 2000s. Across the United States, the federal fair housing laws prohibit discrimination based on race, skin color, national origin, meaning where someone is from or their ancestry, gender, including sexual orientation and gender identity, religion, disability, meaning physical or mental disabilities, families with children under the age of 18, or familial status. Any housing that has federal financial assistance, so whether that's from HUD or other programs like rural development, for example, might be subject to more regulation. And specifically for HUD housing, they have a series of equal access rules that prohibit discrimination within their funded housing based on whether or not somebody's married, sexual orientation, and gender identity. They've expanded their definition of family to really be inclusive of LGBTQ plus families under HUD-funded housing. Here in the state of Michigan, we also prohibit discrimination based on marital status, meaning whether somebody's married or not, their age, with the exception of 55 and older and 62 and older communities. That's senior housing, and that's a legal age limit, but any other age limit is illegal. And then for the first time in our history, as of February 2024, we officially have sexual orientation and gender identity in the books on Michigan Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act law as protected classes. And then local communities, at least 40, probably more than that now, across Michigan have added local protections. Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, Kentwood, Wyoming, Holland, Traverse, Saugatuck, there's a whole group. And we can help you kind of do that homework to look at which communities do have local laws. I think a number of you on the call are in these communities. Ann Arbor, I believe, has 22 or 23 protected classes within their city limits. So oftentimes they restate what's in federal and state law, but can add their own protections. So it's really important, both as advocates and if you are a housing provider, to really get to know your local list of fair housing protections, because it can help you recognize housing discrimination and hopefully prevent it or report it if needed. So we've got a few sources here on how to look for additional fair housing laws. But again, you're welcome to contact any of us directly, and we would be happy to assist you in putting together your list of fair housing protections. I also want to talk about another group very briefly that are protected, again, for federally funded programs in housing. Violence Against Women Act, commonly called VAWA, does provide specific protections for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And I feel like this is a group that is particularly vulnerable in their housing, in both maintaining housing and accessing housing. So we felt like it was appropriate to kind of highlight these protections. There are some limited opportunities for us to bring gender cases under the Fair Housing Act if the housing is not federally funded. So that's kind of a limited set of rights that we will certainly be willing to look at any situation and evaluate to see what we can do to assist with. But again, VAWA really protects people who have experienced or have a history of experiencing domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking in federally funded public housing, like Housing Commission housing or housing agency housing, and as well as with Housing Choice Voucher or Section 8 voucher, any other federally funded project-based programs. So you can always reach out to us if you have questions about VAWA coverage. But essentially, any of these victims shouldn't be denied admission or rental assistance from the federal government just because they are or have been a victim, or even a threatened victim would be covered. They shouldn't be evicted or lose that assistance. They shouldn't be denied admission or rental assistance, losing their subsidies for any reasons related to the abuse, such as having bad credit history or criminal history. VAWA does require housing providers, and again, this is for federally funded housing programs, to honor any abuse protections or other court orders that address access to or control of the housing unit. That's really an important step. And that the individuals are informed of their rights under VAWA. That's supposed to be information included in lease agreements. And then something else that has really, I think, become quite common. It wasn't when I started working in housing, but kind of understanding that victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking are victims, and therefore should not be held accountable for the perpetrator's behavior and shouldn't lose their housing if they are innocent. So there's a movement to splitting leases now to evict the guilty party and allow the victim and oftentimes underage children to remain housed within that housing program. Sometimes they need to be transferred to different units or locations for safety reasons, but that's an important, I think, step in the right direction to helping people who are already vulnerable to keep their housing. So we linked you to MSHDA's VAWA resource page there. So make sure you look for that link in your handouts. Essentially, any housing offered in Michigan is very likely going to be covered by fair housing laws. we have even narrower exemptions than the Federal Fair Housing Act. So apartments, homes, condos, whether they're being sold or rented, even empty lots intended for housing construction can be covered by fair housing laws. Homeowners associations, condo associations, they often don't know or understand fair housing laws, but they are covered, as are mobile homes, manufactured home developments, as I mentioned previously, insurance, but most shared living and sometimes even homeless shelters, transitional housing programs, college dorms, you name it, are covered. Housing offered and run by public housing agencies like a housing commission are covered as well. Michigan has, in addition to expanding their laws to include sexual orientation and gender identity, last summer expanded for the first time their state civil rights law to include a definition of race, which we previously had not had. And this new definition of race includes an element related to crown protections or creating a respectful and open world for natural hair, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, including but not limited to hair texture and protective hairstyles like braids, locks, and twists. These civil rights laws not only cover housing, but employment, education, and public accommodations law. So you may have seen news stories where, for example, a child was sent home from school having had her hair cut off by her teacher. So that would be a violation of this type of law. So that protection now exists here in Michigan as well. There's also been a big movement to look at providing protections across the state for income. Any legal and verifiable source of income being counted as household income has been an important step forward for increasing housing choice. Some local communities have some source of income protections, but essentially it's any benefit or subsidy program that provides funding for housing assistance, emergency rental, veterans benefits would count, Social Security, supplemental security income, disability income, really any legal and verifiable income that's provided on a regular ongoing basis should count as a legal source of income. This bill is pending. There's a movement to reintroduce it in the Senate this year. We'll see if it becomes law. If it would encourage people with housing choice vouchers to really have that ability to take the voucher anywhere in the state. There is a small exemption as it's currently written for landlords who own less than 5 units in the state of Michigan. It also would require any housing voucher agency to move pretty quickly with applications within a month. So currently these bills are written to change both tenant landlord law and Elliott Larson civil rights law here in Michigan. And we'll keep you posted on where this goes next. So I'm going to turn it over to Bree to talk about some national trends.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks for starting us off and getting us some groundwork and understanding fair housing. As Liz mentioned, we really want to highlight sexual harassment today, obviously. But first off, I'm going to talk about some trends that we're seeing along the fair housing movement and kind of before we dive into what sexual harassment kind of looks like. So the National Fair Housing Alliance has been looking at harassment and they acknowledge, there are a lot of marginalized communities, especially women, single parent households, people of color, people with disabilities, immigrants, people with housing assistance tend to be very vulnerable when it comes to harassment in housing. Often people fear retaliation or the loss of housing for reporting that occurring in their housing circumstance. And I'm here to say that retaliation is protected by the Fair Housing Act. So that is something that you as advocates could pass along to those that may be vulnerable to this type of harassment in their housing. Harassment against any protected class can take many different forms. It can be coercion, intimidation, threats, interference, sexual harassment, and all of those things are illegal under the Fair Housing Act, both as a provision of housing and also within a housing setting. So accessing the housing or also once you're in the housing. The National Fair Housing Alliance did look at the across the board nationally what all fair housing centers are reporting and other agencies, and entirely over 2023 there were over 1,500 harassment complaints, which was a really large increase from 2022. It was actually a 67% increase. So a large increase just in the 1 year. And then there is a breakdown of what types of harassment complaints they did receive. And today we'll cover mostly sexual harassment, which is usually a protection under sex. So they had 262 harassment complaints. We're not sure if those are solely sexual harassment. They could be different harassment based on sex. Since 2006, NAFA has been tracking harassment, and last year was the highest the highest record they've reported. So it's on the rise, and it's increasingly more and more prevalent within housing. My hope is it's just more people are coming forward. I hope it's not happening more, but it's hard to say.
Mhm. Yeah, and something that we didn't put in here, but that I've kind of tracked over the years is FBI hate crime data. The majority of hate crimes, which can be very similar and sometimes include elements of harassment under fair housing, the majority of those complaints do occur at or near someone's home within that subcategory. So this is something that is really a significant issue when we think about home as refuge, as our, think about how glad you are to get home after a busy day. Most of us have that relationship with home. And so having that ability to have your safe place, and let alone, understanding home differently as a result of the pandemic and being ordered to stay home if we had homes. I think we kind of understand how important this refuge really is in many different ways now.
Yeah. And then pivoting, so the Department of Justice often works in the with housing sexual harassment cases in housing. And so last year they reported 42 cases in total that were filed, but 10 of those cases involved sexual harassment in housing. They did launch a sexual harassment campaign in 2017 where, bringing it more forward and bringing it really to the forefront. They have filed a total of 39 lawsuits alleging sexual harassment in housing. They've settled 27 of those. They've obtained some favorable verdicts. They've also resulted in almost $12 million in damages for over 340 victims. And then also some more relief to prevent harassment in the future, because that is also, we want to not only be compensated for, any damages people have experienced, but also preventing that in the future. So the DOJ is one of the big agencies, the federal agencies that really deal with sexual harassment in housing. And in the time that we've partnered with them, we have referred cases, 3 cases to them that we have settled with the DOJ sexual harassment cases. So yeah.
Yeah, and the Department of Justice really is, these cases are big. So they typically establish pattern and practice type cases. So these tend to be the bigger cases involving multiple parties. Unfortunately, a lot of victims. Even our small local cases can involve a lot of victims. But this is a big initiative where they pushed a lot of education. And, once a case reaches a certain threshold, if it's big enough to get the DOJ involved, they will take it and run with it. And you can tell they've done a substantial amount of work since 2017.
Yeah, and then last year they settled 6 cases. One of those cases was U.S. versus Dos Santos. This case was a property manager in Massachusetts who had sexually harassed female tenants since at least 2008. And additionally, 2 family trusts that owned the properties were also liable for his conduct. So this is something we'll talk about more later on, but all parties that are involved in the property management side of things are liable for sexual harassment that is occurring within their property, and especially if they're not doing anything about it. But even if they don't know, people are still liable. So in this instance, 2 family trusts were liable. There was the defendant didn't have to pay over $400,000 in damages to the 6 victims. They also had to pay a civil penalty to the United States, and then a more furthering that they won't further discriminate or provide any retaliation to those people that did come forward. And then the property manager responsibilities had to be turned over to a different property manager. And they also had to create a policy, a compliant procedure, and they had to get fair housing training. The consent decree also permanently barred Dos Santos from participating in any property management responsibilities. So these are common outcomes of a sexual harassment case. There's often damages to the parties, a civil penalty, and then the property management usually has to be turned over to someone else, and they have to get training and create some more policies in place. So this case is a very I would say common case of outcomes for sexual harassment complaints.
It includes all the outcomes we want to see, right? Where we have fresh start, new staff, training for folks, policies in place, and ways that people can report this and hopefully get it meaningfully addressed. I think that's one of the biggest barriers you'll continually hear both of us talk about is encouraging people to bring these issues forward and help us, put a stop to it.
And then just really quickly looking at our case breakdown for 2023, we did have 140 cases last year. Majority of those are disability related cases. However, I do want to highlight we did have some gender cases and sexual orientation cases and other protected class, which can include harassment. We have had 13 sexual harassment cases since 2019. So that is something we're looking into. It's not called out specifically in here because it's under a protected basis, usually gender. And then if you look at just our harassment cases in general in 2023, we had 4% of our cases were dealt with harassment. And that is a pretty on the higher side. We did have some that percentage back in 2019 as well, but it's fluctuated, below that since then. So 4% is, I would say, a pretty good chunk of our caseload. It's really hard, it's really hard to know why. Let me start over. So oftentimes it's really hard to uncover. Oftentimes we have gotten calls. Some of our sexual harassment cases have started because of somebody misunderstands what we do as an agency, and they call us looking for housing. And so we've had instances where people have called us, and then toward the end of the call, the person says, well, I'm trying to leave because, my landlord is sexually harassing me. And they're like, oh, well, that's something we can do. So oftentimes people don't think of that as the main concern because they just want to leave the housing, very understandably so. We've also discovered harassment cases through social media and things like that. And oftentimes we just have a culture where people don't feel comfortable coming forward. So it can be really hard to uncover.
Yeah. And I think people are scrambling, right? Like you said, they're calling around to any agency that they can talk to, looking for housing referrals, other opportunities, especially now in such a tight market. They're really focusing on getting to a safe place. And, it's circumstantial when we have the chance to uncover, why they're looking to leave. So we'll dive into it, I think, a little bit more here, but you've touched on some of it.
Yeah. And going back to what you said, Liz, about the market, it's really expensive right now to find housing. So people may feel like it's their only choice, and that's no fault of their own as well, that they're getting taken advantage of. So sexual harassment in housing is illegal under the Fair Housing Act and other federal laws. It includes, unwelcomed sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or any other type of sexual conduct, and as a condition to obtaining, maintaining, using, or enjoying the housing or even housing related services. So not even just getting into the housing and being in the housing, but also any housing related services, if that is being obstructed or, this for that type of thing, that would be
like reserving a community room at an apartment complex. If that's conditioned on going out on a date with someone and that's unwelcome, that's a problem, right?
And sexual harassment can occur to any gender, any age, any person. So this is not just a one one type of person. It affects all people. It often is revealed by, oh, I talked about this, but often we see it from people looking for alternative housing, just trying to feel safe. Claims may be filed even if the person did not experience loss of housing or like any, economic loss. Just the fact of it occurring is enough to come forward and come to our agency and file it. It does not have to be motivated by sexual desire. It can be motivated by hostility towards a particular sex, even if the harasser is the same sex. There are two types of harassment that the courts recognize. The first one is quid pro quo, which is this for that. So that would be engaging in an unwelcome request or demand as a condition for obtaining, maintaining, or enjoying housing or the housing related services. So again, this for that, like Liz had mentioned, even if it's, to get the community room, you have to go on a date, or to get into the housing, provide nude photos, things like that. Even if a person complies with the request, you are still protected. So the protection is always on the person experiencing the sexual harassment.
I think that's made people reluctant to bring it forward too, of they felt like they didn't have any choice, or they knew their next step would be living in their car. And we want to reiterate and hope that all of you advocates on the call will help us put that message out. If it's unwanted, it doesn't matter what actually occurred. If it's unwanted, it is illegal.
The second type of harassment is hostile environment harassment. So any unwelcome conduct that is severe and pervasive and just interferes with the availability, the sale, the rental, the use, the enjoyment of the housing or housing related services. So again, if it's consistent and it's, really bothersome, it doesn't have to be, again, a this for that, but it's just consistently asking you on a date, asking you for new photos, asking for certain things that and creating an uncomfortable, hostile environment for you to live in, that is also protected. And as I mentioned, retaliation is also protected. So if anybody reports this, then, and if their retaliation could be increasing rent, eviction, withholding maintenance, further harassment, or suing, that is all protected. That cannot be a outcome of somebody coming forward with a sexual harassment claim.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail towards the end of the presentation, but these types of cases and this protection for retaliation occurs for any sort of harassment beyond sexual harassment. If it's race or disability-based harassment, these standards and types of cases can also be brought. And I want to emphasize that anyone reporting any type of housing discrimination on any of the protected classes is protected from retaliation. So again, that's something that we really hope advocates can hear and take with you. If somebody is filing a complaint with HUD or Michigan Department of Civil Rights, working with a cooperating attorney, working with a fair housing center, and they get a baseless eviction notice, or they're starting to get charged kind of junk fees without any sort of basis, they don't get maintenance calls returned, they're subjected to further abuse or harassment. All of that is protected simply by someone trying to exercise their fair housing rights. It engages that protection. So really want to make sure that people understand, and hopefully that brings a little more comfort in bringing these types of cases forward.
As I mentioned, everybody that is, owners, property managers, employees, they all can be liable for harassment. And even if any employee commits harassment and no one is aware of it, the owners and property management companies are still held liable. And especially if no action is taken that is within their power to stop the harassment, is even more liability. So this is really important, why training is really important for housing providers, and ensuring that, all their ducks are in a row and that this isn't occurring, because even if somebody isn't aware that it's happening, the company can still be held liable. And now Liz is going to start up a video from the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana. It is a case of sexual harassment that occurred during COVID.
My name is Abigail Savage. I'm a mother. I'm a performer. With the pandemic, it was frustrating and scary. I remember I worked at a bar at the time. I'm like, the last thing that's gonna be shut down is like bars and restaurants. And then within the week is when everything shut down. I had never had to be on unemployment before. I had nowhere to go, and I don't have any family here. And I figured the best option would be just to ask if I could have just like a month. And that's something I've never done before either. And I asked over the phone. He was like, not a problem. And then the next day I get a text message from him asking essentially like, where's the rent money? And I reiterated that we just had a phone conversation about it the day before. And I was under the impression, because he blatantly said, that I could have the month and just pay double the next month. He had asked me if I wanted to come over to his house, which I thought was very strange. And I wasn't entirely sure what he meant, and I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. And I asked him what he meant by it, and he basically said, oh, if you don't want to, I get it. And at this point I was like getting like hot, like agitated, like I was having a physical reaction to it. I was like, I feel like this is what's going on, and I can't believe it, but I need to know for sure. So I asked directly, are you asking me in a sexual way? And he answered yes. So that was his intention. At one point, that it essentially implied if I cared about my son and him having a safe space, that I would do what he wanted me to do. And so I just picked up my son and just walked out the door, and I was like, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what to do. And then I called one of my near and dear friends, and she just like snatched us up, and we just drove around, and we're like, okay, what do we do? How do we figure this out? Because this is not okay. And we decided to call the Fair Housing Center.
Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana and many organizations across the country are specifically trained for dealing with housing discrimination and uncovering evidence for victims to help prove their cases, so we can get away from victim shaming or blaming, especially in sexual harassment situations.
Any type of harassment is unlawful under the Federal Fair Housing Act, whether that be race-based, national origin-based, disability-based, but specifically in Gail's case, we found that it was gender-based. And so ultimately she did decide and wanted to pursue litigation, and so we helped her with the investigation. We also connected her with an attorney that was very specialized in fair housing litigation, and we kind of educated her throughout the entire process. She was never left in the dark.
I was afraid that like something was going to be done that I wasn't aware of, or something would be done that I didn't want to happen, and that was never the case. I was kept up to date with everything. I felt very well taken care of.
So the results of Gail's case, ultimately, we did settle her case in the same year. We did reach what's called a consent decree, where we did reach monetary damages as well as attorney's fees, as well as some injunctive relief. The landlord or the housing provider did ultimately remove himself from the property management side of things, so he had no interactions with any future tenants of any sort, any residents. And we also had required some fair housing training as well, which is very common in fair housing settlements. One thing that I really admired about Gail was her courage to speak up. Unfortunately, I interact with a lot of victims of sexual harassment, and there's so many fears of retaliation or losing their housing. I applaud Gail and her bravery for coming forward and stepping and standing up for what's right. We need a lot more people to come forward and speak what's been happening to them.
For anyone else who's experienced something like this, and I hate that it's happening to anyone, but unfortunately, this is how the world works and is what's happening. Please say something. Even if you feel like you don't have anyone or you're embarrassed. I felt that too, and I still sometimes do. Like it's embarrassing, even though you've done nothing wrong, but you don't have to put up with that at all. No one does. No one deserves it. Take care of yourself.
And then as Liz goes through this slide, there is the evidence that came up from the text messages that Abigail had shared. A big part of when coming forward is saving any documentation, and we'll talk about that later, but that is really helpful in making a case and helpful with having the evidence to show that this occurred. And I want to just touch on one thing that was mentioned in that video that Brady talked about was that, and even Abigail talked about, was that through the whole time when going through a case like this, the Fair Housing Center will walk through the case with you, and it's like your support through this, through the system to file this and to be there to ensure you understand what's going on. And we also would never act in a way without you knowing and understanding the process as well. So that is similar for us as well. And any Fair Housing Center that you report to operates very similarly. So just wanted to share that as well. So some examples of sexual harassment, specifically quid pro quo, so that this for that, I get a favor for a favor type thing, a landlord demanding nude photos in return for, approving a rental application, a property manager evicting a person because they refuse to have sex, a maintenance staff requesting sexual favors in return for maintenance services. So those are just some examples of what that could look like. There are other examples as well, but these are kind of just the basic ones to kind of help you understand what that would entail. Hostile environment, sexual harassment. Again, that's the severe, pervasive, unwelcomed sexual conduct or intimidating hostile behavior. A landlord subjects a tenant to severe or pervasive unwelcoming touching, kissing, or groping without consent. A property manager makes persistent unwelcome lewd comments about a tenant's body. So it could be just, I would say just comments, but even just verbal comments consistently making you uncomfortable, making you feel unsafe in your home. That is the biggest part of this. If things are occurring that are making you feeling unsafe and it's related to sexual harassment, additionally, if it's on another protected class that we've talked about, that is also protected. A maintenance staff member sending a severe, pervasive, unwelcome, sexually suggestive text enters the tenant's apartment without invitation or permission. So again, that progressiveness and that pervasiveness and that, again, unwelcome behavior consistently happening, that is an example of sexual harassment.
We've had clients report that staff were waiting until they could hear the shower running, for example, to then enter the apartment. So really taking advantage of having that access, having that key, and targeting people when they're at their most vulnerable, things along those lines. So it reiterates the importance of challenging these types of behaviors.
Some other phrases that we've heard and seen, people just wanting their bathroom repaired without being asked out, lowering your rent if you're going out with someone, people being scared to be evicted if they resist any of their manager's advances, and then just again, the comments, we've heard like, oh, I'm just joking. You're so pretty though. Don't be so uptight, just that
if there's a rejection, they tend to try to change the narrative is kind of what I've seen. Would you agree with that, Brie? Of just, oh no, that's not what I meant. It's a joke, or no, it's just a compliment.
Yeah. Again, if it's making you uncomfortable and it's consistent and, just making you feel unsafe, then that is definitely something to bring forward. Now, I want to just reiterate that, Liz talked about content warning. We are going to be going into some cases that now that can be a little graphic. So please, if you need to step away or anything, please feel free to do so. This was a case from another Fair Housing Center in 2019. Sarah Yoder filed a federal lawsuit with the Fair Housing Center of Southeast and Mid-Michigan against her landlord, Ryan McDonald, for sexual harassment. In 2018, Yoder reached out to him for an advertisement for $700 a month in a property in Lansing. After the tour, Yoder tried to negotiate for $650 a month, in which McDonald said he bet she would be more fun to negotiate with in person. And then a few days later, he asked if she was still interested in that housing, and she indicated that she was. After that, he said that they might be able to make a deal if she performed a striptease for him. She responded that she wasn't a hooker or a stripper, even for a house, and that was her final message to him. However, he consistently continued to message her. Go to the next slide. He sent a couple more text messages, saying that's not what he was asking for. He wasn't asking for sex. She wouldn't even have to get naked, just do something cute maybe and let him watch. So again, it doesn't always have to be sexual in and engaging in sex, but it is, something again that is sexual in nature, I guess, and asking for, you to do something that is just uncomfortable and not something a housing provider should ask of you. Later, Yoder actually saw the same property listed cheaper by someone else named Jason. And so she went with a friend, and when she did, it was McDonald. McDonald exited the vehicle and started to berate Yoder, saying he was sweaty during their first meeting because he had masturbated while watching her through the windows. So in the you can click on the link that's listed there, but he had been a few minutes late to showing up to their initial meeting before, and she had kind of walked around the property during that time. Again, very lewd comment that was unnecessary. And then when she removed herself from the situation, he continued to scream at her and then called her a racial slur, and she was Native American, so it was along those lines. And then after that, he still continued to message her unwelcome and pervasive comments. It was settled in 2022 for an undisclosed amount. And then these are just some of those text messages and the evidence and those things. This was highlighted on the news as well. And this was a case that the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan referred to the Department of Justice. This was filed in 2020. This case was against Daryl Jones, who owned and managed more than 30 rental properties in Muskegon. And since 2008, it was reported that he was subjecting his female tenants to harassment. This included unwelcome sexual comments, touching without consent, demanding sexual activity in exchange for rent or housing-related benefits, and taking adverse actions for those who resisted or complained about the harassment. So all of the things that shouldn't be done. The first victim in 2018 reported being repeatedly harassed by him making unwelcome sexually inappropriate comments to her about her body when he collected rent. He always collected rent in person. He would make unwelcome requests to go on dates. He would make unwelcome requests for pictures of her naked body, making her unwelcome requests for sexual activity. He would touch her butt without consent, and then delay or refuse repairs and evicting her once his sexual advances were rebuffed. So that was one victim. Another victim had reported from numerous occasions from 2013 to 2016. He would touch her breasts without consent, would make unwelcome comments about his genitalia, and requested that she touch him when he collected rent. And he also, this is something we often see in these cases, is that he told her that she could not have her boyfriend at the property. So that is often a big red flag for us when housing providers are restricting, certain people not being on the property, especially we often see it with male figures not being, or screening for sons or things like that. Really screening done that is screening that is done to ensure the person is vulnerable is often what we see, even if it could be they only are accepting single people or things like that. Those are red flags for us, and would be and separate from this case, but would be something that you should come forward with if that is occurring or if you're hearing about it. A third victim reported in 2016 that Jones repeatedly pressured the female tenant to show her butt and breast to him, offered to reduce her rent if she did, offered to waive the rental payment if she would have sex with him. And then on multiple occasions, he would collect the rent in person and make unwelcome and inappropriate sexual comments to her. He would try to touch her and hug her without her consent, and made unwelcome requests that she give him nude photos of herself. These are only 3 victims. However, more than 3 victims have come forward. This case was in 2023, it was entered as a consent decree, so it was filed, and damages were found. The defendant was required to pay $155,000 to compensate the individuals, pay a $10,000 civil penalty, and then also obtain fair housing training, have somebody else do the property management side of things, and implement a non-discrimination policy and complaint procedure to prevent future sexual harassment at their properties. This one was in Pennsylvania. This one alleges that Alan Woodcock sexually harassed a female tenant in April of 2019 after he entered her home to perform maintenance. According to the complaint, he touched the tenant's body without her consent, forcibly tried to kiss her, and then the Woodcocks evicted the tenant after she reported harassment to not Alan, but Heidi Woodcock. The consent order permanently Alan Woodcock could not indirectly or directly perform any property management responsibility. So completely removed from the property management side of things. So he couldn't do any repairs, advertising, showing of the rental units, anything that involved obtaining the housing, he was no longer allowed to do. And then he was required to pay $13,000 to the female tenant and forgive any outstanding back rent.
Yeah, this settlement, this consent order was one of the more detailed ones where the judge explicitly listed all of the duties this person was no longer allowed to do and not even allowed to advertise anymore. So this case was taken very, very seriously.
And so moving forward, what should be done to ensure that this isn't occurring? Anti-harassment policies should be established and enforced to ensure that this isn't occurring. Before it really becomes a fair housing violation. There should be postings and that like the policy should be posted and all tenants should receive copies of those things. There should be multiple safe ways for tenants to make complaints or report any problems. And then there should be staff in house settings should be trained in fair housing. That is always fair housing training should be happening to prevent harassment, and staff really should include all staff, maintenance staff, HOA boards, condo boards, property managers, not just the people that may be front facing, the leasing staff. It has to be everyone that is included in the company. There should be measures in place to ensure that people who report harassment are protected from retaliation. Talking to tenants to find out whether harassment is occurring and teaching them about fair housing rights and how to report harassment. Properties should hire or designate a complaint coordinator whose primary responsibility is to investigate these reports or complaints and to take the necessary actions quickly.
Thank you, Bree. I'm just going to talk very quickly about harassment and how to report cases to us, but we do welcome questions, so feel free to use the Q&A to enter any questions that you have that we can circle back to before we wrap up today. So as we've briefly mentioned already, the harassment standards include sexual harassment, and harassment is prohibited on the basis of other protected classes such as race, skin color, religion, national origin, ancestry, ethnicity, presence of children, having a physical or mental disability. Those are all protected characteristics, and people therefore cannot be subjected to harassment like coercion, intimidation, threats, or interference with anybody's ability to get housing or enjoy the housing that they already have that's protected by the Fair Housing Act. Specifically, what we've seen in the HUD harassment rule really addresses harassment that's done with the intent to push somebody to leave their housing or vacate a dwelling, or also give up efforts to get housing that they were interested in, whether they wanted to rent or buy. So abandoning efforts to secure the dwelling. So if you have neighbors, staff, any party attempting to interfere with housing access because of these protections, that is problematic. So again, it's the same type of case, whether it's a quid pro quo case or a hostile environment case. So that threatening, intimidating, interfering behavior. We've had landlords say, you know, I've got a neighbor that'll come out and kind of scare off everybody I try to show through the building. They don't have the right to do that. Housing providers can't limit any of the privileges, services, or facilities that come with paying for that dwelling, and they can't withhold any maintenance or repairs contingent both on a sexual relationship or because of harassment. So residents have these protections. People who have already accessed their housing have these protections throughout their residency in housing. HUD has also highlighted harassment based on race, religion, and national origin, which has been on the uptick in the last couple years. So examples of this are Muslim tenants being yelled at with slurs, taunting and threatening a person with a mental disability, subjecting someone to pervasive racial epithets or slurs, defacing homes with racially derogatory or threatening words or images. That's something we have seen in our tenure at the Fair Housing Center. Or a professional, a management company learning that a tenant's repeatedly harassing another tenant because of a disability and they don't do anything about it. That is highly problematic under fair housing. So there is a new fact sheet available from HUD that kind of talks about some of this. Again, anybody receiving federal financial assistance has additional requirements to comply and take serious action in regards to these types of violations. HUD was highlighting the religion protections, which is protecting people who are or perceived to be any sort of member of a religious group, be it Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, or what have you. So again, this is kind of the same idea of pushing people in or out of neighborhoods, telling them even as something as simple as there's no religious community nearby for people like you or with your accent or with your name. Harassment, again, using slurs or stereotypes, or just flat out refusal to rent or engage with someone because of their name, the way they dress, any characteristics that would be associated with a certain ethnicity or ancestry. So HUD highlighted that about a year ago based on a rise in those types of situations. In terms of reporting, anyone can report housing discrimination. You can be a witness, you can be a social worker, case manager who's hearing about these things. You can be the person experiencing it. You can be a person working at the property. Anybody has the right to provide that information to us and we can take it and run with it. The more information we have, the better. So keeping those records, as Bree said, those screenshots, kind of maintaining all that information is really helpful to tell the story, prove what happened, so that we can take action and hopefully address it. Our services to our clients are free. Similar to Abigail's story, our client really directs what happens. We take action only with their consent and authorization. We encourage you to work with our enforcement and intake coordinators, and we are happy to introduce you directly to them. In terms of the types of cases, they can be filed in federal court or state court. That gives you a 2 to 3 year window, depending on which laws were violated. A lot of our cases are administrative complaints. So that is up to a year with HUD or up to 6 months with the state. Regardless, it's our job to kind of help people figure out what the right venue is for reporting and pursuing fair housing cases. And we're happy to do that. We do have a ton of resources and links. It looks like the chat is getting busy. I'm not sure if we have questions in there, but I'm just going to quickly highlight. We have HUD resources from both HUD and DOJ that are all linked here. There's new fact sheets, new materials. They've done a really nice job with a lot of these web pages. There's a direct link to HUD's rule on harassment there for you. We also have a series of MSHDA links, resources that MSHDA has provided for rental housing landlords, LIHTC communities, which is low-income housing tax credit communities, housing choice voucher links. So do please take advantage of those. As I mentioned, we have a lot of information available on our website. You can always contact us directly with information or the topic that you're looking for, but we have developed a lot of both best practices and just kind of advocacy outreach information explaining what fair housing rights are, based on a lot of the different protected classes and some of the more common issues that we're seeing. We're trying to do a lot of education around LGBTQ plus rights, for example, because those rights are new here across the state of Michigan. You do have a link to a survey in the chat, so that is available for you. If you'd like to request a certificate, you can do that there. You know, we'd really appreciate it if you could finish that by the end of the day tomorrow, because we do get a lot of requests. Sometimes we're sending out hundreds of certificates, so give us a few weeks to get those out. If you're interested in more fair housing education, we have an exciting event focusing on disability rights that will take place on October 24th. It's a breakfast event. We do require that you register in advance because we're feeding you, but there's no cost to attend to join us at the Pinnacle Center in Hudsonville next month.